Welcome to Our National Conversation, a podcast in which we discuss politics from all angles. We are completely nonpartisan, and all views, respectfully stated, are welcome here. Our podcast is unique in that it is hosted and run by students who are focused on finding solutions to the biggest problems facing America.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Allow Us to Explain. I'm your host, Makayla Idelburg, and I am a journalism intern here at Our National Conversation. Joining me here today is another ONC intern, Delaney Dickey. Would you like to introduce yourself?
My name is Delaney Dickey, and I am a podcast intern here at ONC. I have lots of experience with advocacy work in regard to domestic violence and human trafficking. This started in high school when I worked alongside with the Governor's Youth Commission when I opened my eyes to the world of human trafficking and domestic violence in high school, which I thought was incredibly late to have this be the first time that these topics are being brought to light. Since then, it has sparked a passion for me, and I've served as a guest panelist and a speaker on related topics and hosted numerous events such as drives for the domestic violence shelter, and I hosted an awareness dance in high school to bring light to the world of human trafficking and domestic violence for teenagers that aren't talked to about these issues as much as they should be.
Thank you so much, Delaney. And as she just mentioned, today's episode will be about another heavy topic such as domestic violence and forms of domestic abuse and things like that. So according to the National Center for Domestic Violence, 10 million people per year especially experience domestic violence by an intimate partner per year, like one person every 20 minutes. Forms of abuse include physical, emotional, sexual, financial abuse, etc. Domestic violence affects everyone across all walks of life. However, according to the World Health Organization, these are some factors that are associated with intimate partner and sexual violence against women, such as lower economic status, lower education, use of substances, exposure to violence, and things like that. So, Delaney, I want to start us off with what kinds of abuse would be considered domestic violence? Like, especially like we hear mostly about physical violence and things like that, but there's definitely way more forms of that. Can you just explain it for us?
Yes. So starting off, of course, we have physical violence. This is, as it sounds, the physical abuse, being hit and along those sort of lines. However, the much lesser talked about forms of violence that are just as prevalent, especially in the United States of America, are emotional, sexual, and financial. So emotional, as it sounds, is when you're being bullied, for lack of a better words, by your partner, by your intimate partner. They're calling you names, they're degrading you regularly in an extreme way. And in that, it's isolating mentally and it's just strenuous mentally. And it's difficult to see that as not normal, especially in our community that kind of normalizes that sort of thing and normalizes fighting, which to some extent is good. However, to some extent, we can't be normalizing the name calling and things along those sort of lines. Moving on, we have sexual violence, which is also not talked about nearly enough. Even if you are married or in a serious relationship, you can still be facing sexual violence, which is such a common misconception that people think that because they're married and because they have this intimate relationship, that they always have to be in that mindset. However, as with any sexual assault case, if you are not wanting it, even if you are married, it is still considered sexual abuse, regardless of your relationship with the person. And finally, financial abuse, which is just the using money to overpower, saying like, oh, if you couldn't leave because you don't have any financial stability without me, and using that money to keep someone in a relationship against their will.
Thank you so much, Delaney. And demographically, who can be subjected to these forms of abuse?
We have our most vulnerable populations, such as people that are in the lower economic status, have lower access to education, have used substances. Another really big one is the exposure to violence. If a child grows up in an environment where that violence is normalized, they are more likely to be in a violent relationship, an abusive relationship when they're older, because that was what was normalized for them as they grew up. However, it is important to remember that every single kind of person, every single demographic of person can be affected by domestic abuse. Just because you're not low income or you have a higher education or you've never used substances does not mean that you can't face domestic violence. This also means that just because you're a man, you can't face domestic violence. Domestic abuse affects everybody, regardless of gender, sexuality, religion, race, age. It can affect any kind of intimate relationship in one's life.
Absolutely. And because it affects everyone, let's talk about domestic violence when it comes to our legislation and our laws. There are things such as the Violence Against Women's Act or the VAWA. Can you talk more about that and like what that represents?
Yes. So the Violence Against Women's Act, despite the name, does protect men and women in domestic violence situations. The federal law is really a housing protection for the individuals that are trying to seek help and escape from that abusive relationship. It is a law that sets forth a federal crime when crossing a state line to go to the intimate partner in order to violate that protection order. It really was a key milestone to making domestic violence more criminalized and more federally punishable offense. Because domestic violence has not been punished as heavily for as long as we want to think it would have been, this was such a monumental milestone in our country to make that step in the right direction of no longer allowing and justifying domestic violence in our communities.
For sure. And I know that when it comes to arrests for domestic violence, it's kind of hard because a lot of survivors struggle with pressing charges against their partners or their abusers. So, what do you think would be a better way to help, you know, make that more accessible to them or make it more, just like make people aware that that's an option for them and they can have that resource?
I think overall, our government has a tendency to make things difficult when someone is struggling mentally. So, in that position, it feels like a person has to choose to either press charges or not press charges right when they're ready to leave. And a lot of our survivors are not ready to make that decision when they just made one of the biggest decisions of their life to leave that relationship. And I think that if moving forward, if there could be a way to support the survivors throughout their entire journey to the point of where they're willing and comfortable and confident enough to press those charges, then that would be wonderful. However, the reality of that is right now, it's expected to be a snap decision. It's expected to be a decision that the survivors need to make when they make that decision to leave. And if they don't make it then it's so much more difficult to press charges and get the consequences for the abuser that might be needed.
And speaking of like just the assistance, like throughout the entire process and experience, there are like women's shelters around every state around the nation, as well as shelter laws that go into that. And I know for California specifically, I'm sure this applies to women's shelters or domestic violence shelters everywhere, is that they don't have like addresses listed on the internet just for privacy and protection. And there's like a specific way you go about contacting them and all things like that. So what are other things that you believe that local governments can do to aid people who are experiencing domestic violence?
Yes, everything comes down to money, and our shelters, that's the biggest thing that's lacking. is, of course, we want to help every single person, and we want to give every single domestic violence survivor the resources they need and the attention they need. But our shelters are underfunded, are overpopulated, and there's just not that money and the resources and the space to give to every single person. So a lot of shelters struggle with the overpopulation and not having enough space. So when a survivor is ready to leave that relationship, they're in this strange in-between stage of they don't necessarily have a place at the shelter yet, but they also don't necessarily have a place at home yet. And it's this purgatory of sorts where people are stuck in the middle of leaving and escaping that relationship just due to the lack of funding in shelters for these men and women that are being abused.
So what do you believe would help raise awareness just for more funds for shelters, or just DV awareness anywhere for like people need help, people need aid from anyone that could? How do you think we can raise more awareness for that?
I think that in the United States of America, talking about our downfalls and our weaknesses is difficult because nobody wants to be uncomfortable and everyone wants to think that we live in one of the best countries in the world. So these problems of abusing our women and sexual violence and human trafficking, we want to believe that they don't happen on our land, they don't happen in our country, and we want to think that it's an outside problem. And breaking the stigma of talking about domestic violence and normalizing the conversations of what is healthy and what's not healthy, what is cute, what is controlling in a relationship is so imperative. And if we were able to destigmatize these relationship boundaries and the conversations being had about it, there would be a lot more of an awareness to what is healthy and what is not healthy. And people would be more willing to listen to the what's not healthy because they're comfortable with that uncomfortability. When we're just uncomfortable, there's no way to challenge our minds and open our hearts to the challenges that other people are facing, because in our heads, everything's perfect. If we're not facing it, then nobody is, because that's just the easier way to think about it.
For sure. And just to piggyback off your funds comment, a source says that different agencies, they interviewed different agencies, and it stated that 16% of their funds come from foundations, and the other 66% comes from the government. There's also, like, for California specifically, there's California grants to ADV survivors, such as grants in psychological traumas, like for therapy or support for elderly victims. And the one that I found most interesting was the accommodation of pets of domestic violence survivors. And I think that's such an important thing because people don't realize, I feel like people don't realize the implications of possession. So like pets are very helpful in these situations, or different objects and things like that. So when it comes to government versus grant funding, which one do you think is kind of more reliable or more important in this case?
Government funding is going to be more reliable in the sense of it's consistent. If a shelter is registered as a nonprofit, that government funding is really going to help that shelter and serve as much of the funding that the government's getting, that the shelter is getting. But grant funding is so important in the sense of our shelters are underfunded. So when they get that government grant funding, then it pushes them into the next level, for lack of a better terms. It pushes them to expand, to support, to reach more people with the services that their shelter is providing. I think it's also important to note the foundation aspect of this and the organizations that are giving to these shelters, because 16% is such a huge part. However, this is in California, where there are a lot more resources for people in these situations and a lot more shelters. So it's difficult to look at these numbers and see that even these numbers need to be improved, and think about the states that have even more lacking resources for these domestic violence survivors in their shelters and whatnot.
For sure, like just speaking of lacking of resources, I just want to mention that more than 50% of requests made by survivors in the US that can't be met are those for like housing and safe shelters, and which is the kind of the first step in like getting away from an abusive relationship is to find a safe space to be and a safe place to be. And if that's not even being acquired, then that first step is kind of being cut off, I think. What do you, would you agree? Would you feel like, or what would you agree the first
Yes,
step is at?
completely. Yes. I think that, as I was saying before, it puts the survivors in this awkward in between stage of they're mentally ready to leave, which is such an important step, but our communities just can't support them financially to leave. And it puts them in this awkward position of where do they go next? And I don't think domestic violence in itself is something that nobody should ever have to face, but feeling like you're trapped in the domestic violence, even though you're ready to get out, I could not imagine. And I hope that moving forward, our shelters have more resources to be able to reach a helping hand out to these domestic violence survivors.
Absolutely. And kind of moving on from the legislation or um, um, law aspect of this topic, when it comes to the community, you know, how should other people go about helping friends or family members or just individuals that they know who are in abusive situations? What we can't help them, we could help them financially, but that's not always the best option for many of us. But what are some things we could do to help out?
That is such a huge question, and a question that does not really have a correct answer, because every survivor is going to need different things and going to need support in different ways. Generally speaking, the biggest way is to just stay true to your own morality in your relationship and be very upfront with the good and the bad, what is healthy, what is not healthy. And going back to that idea of talking about that. If you are concerned that one of your friends is in an unsafe relationship and an abusive relationship, being able to talk about what is involved in a healthy relationship and what is involved in an abusive relationship, and helping that friend make those distinctions, and maybe not outright telling them that they're in an abusive relationship, because not everybody's ready to hear that, but just having those conversations to possibly help your friend think it through. But also, when your friend comes to you or anyone in your life comes to you talking about the downsides of their relationship, not to judge them. It's so easy to just think, oh, we'll just leave. But it's not that easy for people. And it's so difficult to see from an outside perspective of how trapped and isolating it would feel to be in an abusive relationship, whether that be physically, emotionally, sexually, or financially. So having that mindset of listening to them and caring about them more than you are judging them is so important.
Absolutely. And just also to piggyback off of, you keep mentioning healthy relationships versus unhealthy relationships. And when it comes to what is normalized generationally, um, it seems like, especially with this generation, our generation, is that things like abusive tendencies are kind of normalized now, such as sharing passwords or locations or other things. And almost to the point where if you don't participate in this, you're considered the bad guy, or considered like, oh, um, maybe you don't trust your partner, or maybe you're not like as deep into your relationship as you should be, or maybe you should watch out for these things if you're not doing it. So how do you explain just like the generational normalization of these tendencies, and how do we break ourselves away from it to maintain our healthy relationships?
It is difficult to think outside of what you know. And because this is a time that we are all facing that's so different than any other time before, with the influence of social media and whatnot, it is the lines between cute and controlling is getting blurred, because we are normalizing so much, from even wearing a necklace with your significant other's name on it is such an idea that is normalized now. Everybody does it, so it couldn't be controlling, right? And that idea of if everyone's doing it, then it's healthy is everywhere. And it's considering so many different topics, such as that sharing passwords. When technology first came out, you were told to never share your password with anyone because it wasn't their place to have it. But now in our generation, and especially in our generation while dating, it is so expected for you to share a password. The second that you put a label on the relationship, it's expected that you already have that password shared. Because if you don't, then you're hiding something. But in that, it's isolating because you don't get to have a relationship with one person because now your significant other is involved in that relationship. So if I'm texting my sister, but my boyfriend has my password and he can see everything I'm texting my sister, I'm no longer able to say everything that I want. I'm no longer able to process my emotions as I would have before he would have my password. It's the same idea with location sharing at all times. We have Find My Friends, Find My iPhone, Life 360, Snap Maps even, where anyone can see anything you're doing at all times. And while that seems like it would be the opposite of isolation, it is isolating because you can no longer do anything without everyone's eyes watching you. And because human nature tells you that you're being judged and to judge, it's impossible to feel like you're free from that, which puts you in this position of feeling reliant on these relationships because they must care about you, because that's what we're told. If they're checking your location, they care. But at what point is that line? Where is the boundary between them caring and them controlling? And for our generation, that line has been getting blurrier and blurrier as we move forward because of the new technologies coming out and the new trends, and everything is just so confusing that what is considered toxic and what's considered healthy is seemingly becoming a Venn diagram at this point. But it shouldn't be that way because there should be a clear boundary of what is allowed and what is not allowed.
Absolutely. And kind of just to close off this segment, when it comes to people going out and finding relationships or finding partners or even friends, what are some red flags we should all look out for when picking a partner or picking a friend, and investing in these friendships to kind of, stray away from the danger before we get into it, if possible?
Yes. It is important to note that even if you don't see any red flags in the beginning, doesn't mean that you made a bad choice. Sometimes those red flags are not prevalent until much later, and that's not on the person. That is on the person that has the toxic trait. It's not on one's character judgment, because sometimes people do change, and not only do people change, but people reveal more of themselves that can be the more of the red flags that we didn't see initially. But initially, the biggest thing is the validating feelings. If you feel like from the start you're not able to share your thoughts and feelings without filtering yourself, that is the number one red flag. It is to the point of you feel like you have to think through every single word you say and how it could possibly be construed and how it could possibly be thought of. And if you are already stressing about that within the first, second, third time of hanging out with someone, and to the point where you're stressed and you're scared that they're going to take something the wrong way, that is a huge red flag. Friendships and relationships should be something that are fun and are lighter in our relationship, in our lives. Life is already heavy enough without the relationship drama. So if you're already stressing about that so soon, it is a huge red flag. I also think that coming out the gate, when they are feeding into the trends and not listening to your boundaries when it comes to the trends, such as location sharing and password sharing, that is a huge red flag. And of course, the number one red flag is going to be not listening to your boundaries. But if they listen to them and they acknowledge them, but then they try to counter, that is also a red flag, air quoted, because that is such leverage. If they say, oh, you don't want to share location, well, I share location with all of my friends because I don't do anything that I don't want my friends to see, then you start questioning that boundary. And while it doesn't seem like they challenged that per se, it's intellectual warfare of, oh, well, are they going to think that I'm doing something bad because I'm not sharing it with them? When really that's a boundary that you can have. So many people in our generation were brought up feeling like it's rude to kind of air quote put people in their place. But in relationships, it's so important to do that and to let people know what you're going to allow and what you're not going to allow. And when someone crosses into that, what you're not going to allow, ideally, the first time it happens, you mention it and you put it back on the right side, or you know how to move forward. That's going to be best for you. And of course, that's not always the case, but having those boundaries is not rude and it's not incorrect. And it's so vastly important that especially the Gen X, Gen Alpha people learn that, because it's been something that we were taught is on the rude side. It's rude to call someone out for their actions, but we need to as a community, because if we don't, then these toxic behaviors are just going to become even more normalized in our society.
Absolutely, Delaney. Thank you so much for those examples and giving us those discussion points that I feel like a lot of people need to talk about these days, especially with older generations and the newer generations, like you mentioned, Gen X and Gen Alpha. And thank you. It definitely gives us and our listeners something more to think about when going into other relationships. So thank you so much. Like I said, thank you so much, Delaney, for joining me, and thank you to everyone listening here for tuning into this week's episode of Allow Us to Explain. This has been a heavy topic about domestic violence. Delaney, is there anything you want to plug, like your social media or any resources that you know of that you would like to plug here?
The biggest thing that I would like to plug is, if you are in an abusive relationship and you do want to seek help, there are so many resources that are online, and there's so many helplines, both nationally and locally. So even if it might feel like an isolating time, you're definitely not going through this alone, and there is help.
Thank you so much, Delaney, and thank you again for joining us. You can find us here at Our National Conversation at ournationalconversation.org, or Our National Conversation on our social media handles such as TikTok, Instagram, and X, or formerly known as Twitter. And also our NATO Convo, that's on X or Twitter, my mistake. And tune in for next week's episode of Allow Us to Explain, where we talk about the primaries coming up. So thank you all so much again for joining me, and have a great day.
This podcast was brought to you by Our National Conversation, a place where students generate policy solutions to the biggest problems facing America. Join us in freeing political dialogue from hyperpartisanship. To learn more about what you heard today, check us out at ournationalconversation.org. You can also follow us on social media at Our National Conversation to show your support and keep up with our latest efforts.